Hey guys, Mr. D. Philippus here for the second lesson this week for social studies. Today, we're going to find out what happened with the Dutch and Lenape, and we're also going to hear about another new group. So, before I begin, and I am going to try some new stuff today, I have a drawing pen. So I'm going to see if I'm going to be able to use it today. So before we begin, make sure you have your social studies book. We left off at page 61, and we're going to read the last little blurb here on 61 today called New Sweden. So before I start that, I just thought it was really important to review. So at this time in our state, which is right here, New Jersey, remember it looks like the old woman. Here's her nose right here. Okay. Just so there's some reference point, Pennsville would be right about here. All right, so that's where Pennsville would be. So I'm just going to write Penns because my marker, it's very hard to write with your finger. All right, so right where that dot is, that's right about where Pennsville was. Now, at this time, the Lenape were all up and down our state. Okay, now the first group of Europeans that settled in New Jersey were the Dutch. In the last reading, we heard that there was some trouble in terms of agreement over trading between the Dutch and the Lenape. Now, eventually, the Dutch won. So the Lenape, they continued to trade with the Dutch. Now, today, we're going to hear about another group that also came from the continent of Europe. Now, remember, inside a continent, there's a bunch of different countries. So in Europe was the Dutch, and the Dutch were from the country, the Netherlands. Today, the second group we're going to hear about were the Swedish people, and they are from a country called Sweden. And Sweden is also in the continent of Europe. So the Swedish eventually also came across the Atlantic Ocean, so all this blue came across, and they decided to settle in New Jersey as well. So that's what today's lesson is going to be about. All right. So if you don't have your book, pause it and go grab it. You are going to have some questions to answer when we're done this. So we are on page 61. All right. Title is called New Sweden. All right. It says in 1638, people from Sweden settled along the Delaware River in what is now southwestern New Jersey. They called their colony New Sweden. All right, so the Delaware River, you guys should be very familiar with because the Delaware River runs right near Pennsville. In fact, many of you, when you went to the park to go watch the Blue Angels, the Delaware River was right in front of you. So this is where the Swedish came in at. So they came across the Atlantic Ocean, went around Cape May into the Delaware Bay. Once you get up about here, right before Pennsville, that's where the Delaware River starts. Now, they actually landed very close to Pennsville. They landed in a city right here called Salem. Now, it's pretty cool because Salem, it's very close to us, and Salem has a very, very rich history in terms of the people that first settled in our state. So the Swedish, they settled in Salem, and eventually they moved to a town right about here called Swedesboro. I'm sure some of you have heard of it, and it's easy to remember because the Swedish settled in Swedesboro. This is not easy to do. All right, so right where that dot is, I'm just going to write Sweden. It's not easy to do, so I apologize. But right here where that dot is, that's where the Swedish settled. So, and that would be Swedesboro. So they came in through the Delaware River, and they ended up living here for quite some time. Now, they also saw what the Dutch were doing, and they wanted in, right? And that's what we're going to talk about now. So they saw that the Dutch were trading with the Lenape, and they were getting all these furs, and they were shipping those furs back to Europe to get lots of money. So the Swedish thought, if they're doing it, why can't we do it? All right, so back in our book, right after it says New Sweden. So remember, the Dutch's colony was called New Netherlands. The Swedish colony in New Jersey was now called New Sweden. So a lot of news, right? New Netherlands was in New Jersey. It's not called New Jersey yet. And New Sweden was also in this state that was not called New Jersey yet. We will be finding out why it's called New Jersey soon. Okay? So back in the book, it says the Swedish colonists built several forts. They also began trading for furs with the Lenape. Now, probably could have predicted this, but this upset the Dutch traders who wanted the furs all for themselves. So the Dutch got very angry and upset and jealous when they saw the Lenape were also trading with this new group of Europeans called the Swedish. Can you think of a word to describe the Dutch? Jealous. Very jealous. They're not good at sharing. They wanted it all for themselves because they wanted to be the only Europeans that were bringing those furs back to Europe. Now they have this new group to compete against. It's just like today in the real world where you have different companies that are constantly competing with each other. Okay, so you look at a store like, or a company like Apple that makes like iPhones and things like that. And then you look at a company like Google. Okay, now Google, they make the Chromebook that we're on right now. And Apple also makes laptops as well. So those companies are always competing with one another to try to get more money and more customers. Same thing was true even back 400 years ago between the Dutch and the Swedish. They were competitors against one another, and they didn't want to have a competition. They wanted it all for themselves. So what do you think is going to happen? The Dutch are jealous that the Swedish are barking up the wrong tree, and they're taking the same furs that the Dutch want back to Europe. What's going to happen? Well, excuse me, I'm going to sneeze. My apologies. Excuse me. Sorry. The colony lasted for 17 years. Then in 1655, the Dutch governor took over New Sweden. Now, it doesn't say in our book, but there was actually a conflict or a battle between the Dutch and the Swedish because both groups of people wanted the furs all to themselves. So the Dutch ended up winning that battle, and the Dutch took over. Most of the Swedish colonists, this is back in our book, ended up staying. They remained in that area. They didn't leave. They still stayed here. They still lived here. But the difference was now they had to follow the rules of the Dutch. In 1660, the Dutch settled the village of Bergen, near what is today Jersey City. So that's going to be way up here. All right, so Bergen is in Jersey City, going to be way up here. So you can see this is over some time. The Swedes and the Dutch eventually started to make their way north. Okay, they started to go up the state, and they started putting more more forts, we call them, okay, where people lived all along the way. All right, and each one of these forts would be a place where people would live, and they would start trading with other Lenape people at those forts. And then, remember, we talked about last time, the Dutch also had New Amsterdam, which is today New York City. Okay, so now they could sail out from here back across the Atlantic Ocean, and they were able to bring their furs back to Europe to sell, to make money. Okay, so why do you think the Dutch decided to take over New Sweden? Why did they decide to do that? Well, and that you can see that's the question at the bottom here for cause and effect. In order to trade with the Lenape, they needed to not have the competition of the Swedish. So in order to trade with the Lenape, the Swedish were trading with, they didn't want the competition. So they decided that they were going to fight them and that they were going to have no more people to compete with. And that's when the Swedish decided to join forces with the Dutch and follow their rule. So that way there was no more conflict. All right, so now we have the Lenape, the Dutch, and the Swedish all trying to work together. All right, so what I want you guys to do right now is head over, answer the Google form questions for today's lesson, and make sure you do your best. I will see you soon.